Hi everyone, and welcome to today's Tech Talk webinar. I'm Paul Verna, Vice President of Multimedia at eMarketer. Thank you for tuning in. Tech Talk webinars are special presentations where we open our studio to guest presenters from the worlds of media, ad tech, and martech. The title of today's webinar is The Retail Data Dilemma, Creating CMO-CIO Synergies. This implies that collecting data for the sake of having data is not only counterproductive, but directly affects performance. Today's session will address why so many retailers find themselves rich in data and poor in execution. Joining us today are Mahmoud Arram, co-founder and CTO of Bluecore, and William Bonnell, retail customer engineering lead at Google Cloud. They'll be sharing how to democratize data for marketers and reduce reliance on technical resources and more. Before we hear from our presenters today, please keep in mind that you don't need to take notes. You'll receive a link to view the slides and full recording of today's presentation. Today's topic is very popular. We have a lot of registrations for today's webinar that include leading retailers and brands, and we want you to participate. You can use the window on the lower right-hand side of your screen to ask questions. We'll try to respond to as many as we can, so please keep them coming. So let's get started. Take it away, William.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the webinar. This is an exciting time to be a retailer. There's a lot of disruption happening in retail, and there's plenty of opportunities for you to differentiate. Customers are demanding new ways to shop and interact with your company. Customer service is powered by conversational AI. Digital transformation is happening across your entire retail value chain, and new business models to drive growth in your company and the retail industry. Retailers have to invest heavily in technology to connect with their customers, test these new business models, and adopt game-changing technologies. To do this, retailers have to think like a technology company to be successful. I often hear retail customers say that they think of themselves more as a technology company than a retailer. And you can see some of these stats that kind of give you a sense of the disruption and the growth happening in the retail industry. All of this data that is being collected across the value chain about your customers is resulting in an explosion of data. You can see here that 90% of the world's data is created in the last 24 months, but less than 1% of it is analyzed. What we find is that most retailers have the collection part down. They understand they need to collect this data, and they're capturing events happening on their website, advertising channels in the store, supply chain, even the digital assistants we talked about. But what continues to be an immense challenge for retailers is turning all of this data into actionable insights. This is because the data is all over the place within a retail organization, and it's siloed between IT and the marketing organizations. And even within the IT organization, data is often siloed because of legacy platforms, acquisitions of other companies, or even a lack of strategic imperative to manage this data together. As you can see here, the average retailer uses 30 separate tools just for marketing, for the MarTech part of the business. That's not to mention all the other tools they use for their other classic systems. So the partnership between IT and marketing is more important than it's ever been before. The CIO at a retailer historically collects data from these retail systems that I talked about, POS, supply chain, call centers, and they drive retail reporting from it. Whereas the CMO collects this data from the online interactions and executes campaigns based on that data. IT often hasn't been in the position to move fast enough for the marketing organizations or for new digital opportunities, so CMOs often have outsourced a lot of the technology to digital media partners. This results in customer data that's not well integrated with IT, so it's further siloed from a lot of the data IT is collecting, and customer data security itself may be suspect. This gap is so big that it makes it difficult to take action in a timely and meaningful way. So if you're kind of embarking on a personalization or a loyalty program, this becomes challenging because this data is not integrated and it's not able to be as responsive or real-time as you need it to be. So Google Cloud enables organizations to pull all of this data together from disparate silos and share this data across an organization while reducing the amount of data that has to move around. Enterprises can accelerate queries without managing the underlying infrastructure to do so, and this is powered by our industry-leading data warehousing platform, BigQuery, and our comprehensive big data ecosystem. Customers can ultimately derive new insights from all of this data and infuse every aspect of the omni-channel customer journey with these insights. Retailers like the Home Depot, Ulta, DSW, and others leverage Google Cloud and have already realized many advantages to taking this approach. We also partner closely with companies like Bluecore, who can help enterprises quickly activate their customer data. Bluecore's technology is built natively on Google Cloud Platform, and retailers can leverage Bluecore to collect and activate on customer behavior and produce catalog data inside of Google BigQuery with an automated workflow. I'll hand it over to Mahmoud Arram, Bluecore CTO, to discuss more about Bluecore.
Thank you very much, William. Now, I've had the good fortune to work with a lot of retailers and brands, big and small, and this is a collection of things that we have learned in working with those retailers and specifically with the CIOs and the CMOs. So typically, to get the CIO and the CMO to work well together, the overall approach is to create a common framework for how to do data and how to derive insights and execution out of it, come up with a common data model that allows them to use consistent semantics on how to discuss the data, and then execution, right? How to execute on things like marketing automation. Now, it sounds high level and vague, so we should dig into it by taking a real example. So in the world of a CMO, a company, and in this case, a retailer, but a lot of this also applies to different verticals, is the company objective in this example is to increase revenue by $1 million. And that is the overall objective. Now that gets turned into key results that the marketing organization as a function executes on. So a key result could be increase email revenue by $200,000, decrease unsubscribes by a certain amount, and reduce customer churn by another percentage. Now those key results can then be mapped onto the data, and an interesting thing to do here is to think about, well, what are the insights that as a marketing organization you need to be able to derive from your data? What are the questions that you need to be able to answer? And what is the value associated with executing on those insights? And what you'll find is that the value actually depends, the optimal value depends on sort of the execution timeline. So an example on, well, how do I segment my customers who are about to churn and those who are loyal? You know, we have a few days to figure this out, but being able to put recommendations, or what product recommendation should I put in an email that goes out right now? The absolute best value for that is to be able to execute on it within seconds. So this sort of like framework on insights tied to execution and timeline and value helps then prioritize, well, what are the asks or what are the capabilities that we need to be able to do with our data in order to clarify the ask to the CIO or the IT organization. So to boil down sort of the value and timeline framework that you've seen previously, in the case of retailer, it's being able to segment customers predictively, right? So being able to do that over days before they actually take action or do not take action. Then being able to segment them on the fly based on behavior in order to be able to do things like behavioral triggers. And then also being able to do just-in-time recommendations. You know, retail has a very complex data set, and we'll look into that. But the catalog also moves at very high speed, and being able to put the correct recommendations at the right time needs to happen sort of within seconds. I would say that, you know, like the top two, being able to predictively segment customers and being able to segment them based on behavior, are things that are sort of like generic and useful across business, not just for retail. Perhaps the recommendations part is specific to retail. All right, so that was the world of the CMO. Now, from the vantage point of the CIO, especially if this is a retailer or a brand that has been around for a while, you have a lot of data. And retail has really, really complex data. And there are sort of two axes at which you can classify this data in terms of the speed at which it's generated and it moves, and the structure of which that data takes shape in. So a simple example would be, well, catalog and customer behavior online happens in real time, and it's structured in a way that makes the most sense for retail. But then things like customer attributes, opt-in and out lists, those are structured as lists, right? And those are common in sort of across other verticals. But those change a lot less often than, say, behavior. So So this is like an interesting way to look at the different types of data that a retailer would have, right? You have ID maps that refer to customers, perhaps in your mobile app, if you happen to have one, store locations, if you're a hybrid retailer. Now, typically what happens is that there is a separate piece of technology, in this case on the marketing stack, that is responsible for dealing with one of those data sets. So for analytics, for real-time behavior, you have an analytics system. You also have an e-commerce platform. Perhaps you have an email service provider, a DMP, some sort of like CRM. A lot of different technologies that were built specifically to deal with a special type of data, right? Now, to be able to when you actually dig into it deeper, you'll see that the actual landscape, like, so this is looking at the LumaScape of the different pieces of technology that are available in marketing stacks right now. There are like 5,000 of them. So essentially, while these are the categories, every retailer would have a bit of a snowflake, right? They would have a different technology stack for marketing because there are so many choices for each one of these boxes. So the CIO is expected to have a magic wand that they can wave and be able to help the CMO execute on their asks, on the three sort of execution strategies that we had outlined, around segmentation and being able to personalize using product recommendations. And essentially, to make that happen, we would have to integrate at least 4 types of data sets, right, that span different speeds and different structure. So being able to get customer behavior, changes in the catalog, customer attributes, and the active list, those are the types of data that we would need to integrate. And if you overlay the technology, you would see that there are at least 3 different systems that we would need to integrate in order to execute on that. The first one being, well, the e-commerce platform itself, or the commerce platform. This is the overall data model for what an e-commerce platform looks like. It has orders and customers and products and relationships between them. The second system would be the site analytics sort of data model. It has visitors, pages, and events, right? And they're called visitors rather than customers because some of them are anonymous. And they're called pages rather than products, etc. So the semantics are not consistent. And then on the email service provider itself, you would see that it has contacts and then lists, profile data, and supplemental data. None of that is very e-commerce specific because email service providers typically exist to service multiple different verticals, right? So it's a horizontal software platform. So the difficulty in integrating all of these systems, especially that your own combination of different pieces of technology is unique, such that there isn't much prior art, is that there is no common data model, right? So each of these systems speak a different language and integrating them becomes incredibly hard. So that becomes a really large project, and at the end it looks something like this. There are multiple complex systems that are wired together, perhaps via FTP files and sort of like other methods of moving data around in the enterprise. The different teams that are involved are cut across the organization. So you have marketing ops, data analysts, the vendor itself of the different systems, perhaps systems integrators. So it ends up being really, really complex. And this is why, and this is data that we got from Ascent to actually via a data set via eMarketer that has pulled marketing executives at retail and elsewhere about, well, what are the different tactics that you are going to employ in sort of the upcoming year. And for data-driven personalization, there's a very big gap between the difficulty of the tactics and the efficacy of it, much higher than any of the other tactics. And I suspect it's because it's very hard to execute upon. And if the execution was a little bit less complicated, perhaps the efficacy would be higher. All right, so how do we solve this? Well, I think that there's a different approach, and that one is, rather than starting with the technology stack and the data that you already have, let's actually start with our business model, right? And let's start with the domain of our business and then figure out how technology can execute upon that model. So in the case of retail, if we look at it from a data model perspective, there are really 3 high-level entities that make sense for retail. It's the customers that I have, the products that I'm selling, and behavior, right? And behavior being specific things that happen at a specific timestamp, either by customers or products. An example of that would be customers purchasing products, products changing in price, or perhaps getting remerchandised from categories to others. That would be sort of a simple model, right? That is based on things that are either happening on the site or perhaps is happening at your brick and mortar stores. Now, once you have this data, and obviously I'm glancing over, well, where is this model actually like stored and how is it collected, right? Like Google Cloud Platform has a continuum of different data storage capabilities, right? But we're sort of glossing over that right now. But if you have a lot of data that is modeled in a way that is highly structured, if you then collect it and collate it in this specific structure, you would then be able to build recommendations on top. So things like predictive cumulative lifetime value of a customer by looking at his or her purchases, perhaps statistical affinity between customers and products, and even product-to-product recommendations and customer-to-product recommendations. If you are selling, say, office supplies or beauty products, perhaps, well, which of these products tend to be replenishable, and what is the specific cadence for every individual customer at which they actually replenish that product. These are all like very interesting insights that can be turned into action. So if you have a model like this that is based on your business, and it can be operationalized in a way that it can be interrogated, and then in a way that can be interrogated for insights and at the same time for execution. So an example of that for retail is, well, I want to find products that are newly merchandised, and then I want to find customers that have high affinity towards that category but haven't purchased. Chances are they haven't even looked at those products since they are brand new. So they have affinity towards that category, and then also have a high CLV, right? And all of that, products that are newly merchandised in the last 3 days, and that would yield a set of customers. So in the context of retail, it makes sense to think about customer subsets in terms of funnels. It's a fundamental abstraction that makes sense for sort of like marketing teams. By the same token, once I have that set of customers who are interested in my newly merchandised products, I should be able to interrogate that same model in order to give them recommendations, right? So for each one of those customers, well, tell me what is the next best purchase. Perhaps that is a different sort of recommendation block in an outgoing email in addition to the newly merchandised products that they're interested in. Or perhaps it's choosing, what is the absolute next best purchase for this customer from this set of newly merchandised products. Now, for retail specifically, since there's a lot of complex data and the execution timeline is very tight, you need to be able to execute on things in seconds and perhaps hours, and there is a precipitous drop in sort of performance if things are delayed by much more than that. One way is if you put the execution and insights in the same system, you would be able to execute on things such as, well, highly personalized email, right? Like email is a very big channel for retail. This is actually a real live example of a furniture retailer. And if you sort of squint at these outgoing emails, you would notice that each and every one of them has a unique set of product recommendations that were chosen for that customer. Right? Perhaps it has a very different offer as well, right? Either based on a predictive capability or something else. So what are the key takeaways here? Well, the first one is there are lots of different insights, and you need to be very careful in plotting them according to cost, execution value, and the optimal timeline for that, because that would help the CMO and the marketing organization prioritize which insights and which capabilities to ask of the IT organization. Then, each of the teams or each of the functions need to model the domain first, and then figure out how to transform the existing data into it, or even start with the fresh data and sort of be able to transform it into that model, such that we have shared abstractions for marketing and IT to be able to communicate with. And then to meet or exceed goals, retailers specifically need to be able to put data and execution in the same system. And this is because of the very strict execution timeline requirements. Perhaps some other businesses can afford to shuttle customer lists around between insights and execution systems, but for retail, that really affects performance.
Okay, thanks Mahmoud and William for a great presentation. Bluecore is a new advertising partner with us, and we're very excited to have had you join us today. So thank you for educating eMarketer's audience, and we hope to have you with us again soon. Let's move on to the Q&A. We have a number of questions coming in from our audience. The first one is, my IT department tells me that they already have the data and that they can solve many of these issues, but we're still not making any progress. So how do we get past this stalemate?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting one, and we hear that quite a bit. And I think it's because sometimes the asks are not very clarified. Yes, we have the data, but are you able to? Can I then tie it to execution and be able to execute on it in seconds, right? So I think that the reason these sort of mismatched expectations happen is because we don't have a common framework in which value is assigned and execution speed is outlined. And I think this is really what it comes down to is if you dig into how fast can I execute on it, this is when both sides realize that, well, we have the data, but it's not structured in the way that makes it conducive to the execution.
And this is William from Google. Just to add on to that, like I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, that data is commonly collected, but it's not necessarily collected all in the same place. So even though it's collected, it's very hard to process it. And then as you're starting to apply data science, machine learning, and artificial intelligence, not having that platform that is running close to that data also makes that a challenge.
Thanks to both of you for weighing in on that. The second question is, this sounds great in theory, but what's your recommendation as to how to get started with a proof of concept?
Yeah, so I think I think that sometimes it becomes, it can get easy to sort of get stuck in the details of where to get started. I think that the best place to get started is what is going to move the needle on specific key results for marketing, right? For retail, typically I think this is, hey, well, I send a lot of email. Can I make some of it personalized since this is my biggest channel? And typically, what we've seen makes the most sense is start with segmenting your outgoing emails better, and then start by putting recommendations in some of these outgoing emails, or even start by sending triggered sort of emails based on customer behavior.
Great, and another one for you, Mahmoud. You talk about data and execution together in the same platform. Are you suggesting that retailers license yet another platform? Doesn't that make things more complex?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting one. So there are two ways to look at it. Well, if you have systems that don't talk to each other, then you are introducing a new system by trying to integrate all of them together, right? And typically it's home brewed, or it is sort of abandoned. So that actually creates a lot of operational challenges. The other one is, sometimes it's interesting to think about consolidation, right? And do you need a CRM and an email service provider that are separate, right? Can both of them be one? Do you need something do you need an email service provider and also a system that can sort of execute in multiple channels? So those are two ways to look at it. Would this reduce complexity overall? In this case, it's okay to add another piece of technology. And can I consolidate some of the existing pieces of technology on my stack?
Great. Again, Mahmoud, another one for you. How can I get insights from the data? What's your first consideration to getting all the data in front of you?
Yeah, I think one of the things we glossed over is, well, how do I collect all of this data to begin with, right? I have data that is being generated on the site, and I have data that is being generated from my offline stores. Now, I think perhaps William can weigh in on this, since Google has a lot of interesting ways to capture technology. The way Bluecore does it is, since we only focus on retail, we have an interesting way of capturing all of this data right from the e-commerce website. And typically, our system takes feeds from offline stores, right? And then we're able to unify that data on the fly. So that's how it works specifically for retail.
Yeah, and thinking about it from Google's standpoint, Bluecore itself runs on our best-in-class data warehouse platform called BigQuery. So BigQuery is this platform to be able to store and analyze all of your data from all channels. BigQuery was actually built by Google for Google, so it scales to petabyte scale, but we've made it available to the world. It's completely serverless, so you don't need admins to manage your infrastructure. It integrates very closely with our ML AI platform, so you can derive insights from your data in real time. And we even have ML built directly into BigQuery with BQML. So if you're thinking about that, it's a really good platform for that. And then we've got a big data ecosystem that helps you kind of cleanse and kind of feed in your data into BigQuery, so you can kind of manage it that way.
Great. And another question here. Is a CDP, consumer data platform, the answer for aligning data, tech, and real-time insights?
I think that sort of like it's a little bit too early to say. My very like sort of personal opinion is that the problem with CDPs is that they are just for insights and they don't necessarily tie to execution. So you still have that problem of latency between the insights system and the execution system. I also think that retail tends to be a lot more complex than other verticals. So having a system that is built for a lot of different industries and sort of like being horizontal, trying to shoehorn it into retail becomes a little bit difficult because you lose the nuances of, subtle changes in the catalog, changes in price, etc., that a general purpose system isn't able to like execute on. I also think that, is that a standalone system, or is that sort of like a feature of other like existing technology on your stack? So, for example, I know that all of the big marketing clouds are looking into building CDP as a feature of their systems, right? Like even Microsoft Dynamics has a CDP. So that's one way to think about it. As far as like Bluecore, for example, has an underlying quote unquote CDP, right? Because we needed to be able to collect the data and unify it into that model that I showed in order to be able to execute on it. So I think it's an interesting sort of architectural tenet of design of sort of being of systems that execute on data, but I'm not sure it makes sense for retail specifically as a standalone product.
Great, and we have time for one last question. And if you both feel like taking a cut at it, that's great. How do you determine what time frame you have to react to specific data points?
I think, so my sort of like practical view on this is, well, assume that you need to be able to do it as fast as you can, right? So seconds, and then sort of like ask the question, well, can I actually like afford to be able to execute on this in seconds? Like, so for example, if it's a predictive model, chances are, it can only run like once a day, right? So then you can't really afford to be able to execute on the insight in seconds. So then like days it is, and that is sort of the sweet spot between how much value can I get from the insight and the execution, and what are my realistic capabilities. So that's how I would do it. Assume it's seconds, and then see what you're actually able to do. But if it's days, I think this is where we see a lot of lowered performance.
Thank you both for all the excellent points you made and for answering the questions from the audience. We really appreciate it. Before we wrap up, I'd like to take a moment to tell you what's happening across eMarketer's media channels. Next week, we have another Tech Talk webinar lined up for you on B2B marketing. We also have our Meet the Analyst live video series, and we'll be closing the month of May with a session on location intelligence featuring eMarketer Principal Analyst Yuri Wormser. You can check out and register for upcoming Analyst and Tech Talk webinars at eMarketer.com/webinars. On the audio side, don't forget to tune in to Behind the Numbers, eMarketer's daily podcast with our host, Marcus Johnson. And finally, please check out the new eMarketer daily forecast videos that bring our forecast to life. You can find them every day in the eMarketer daily newsletter. So again, remember that you'll receive the link to today's presentation, and feel free to share it with your colleagues. Thank you all for your time, and thanks again to Mahmoud, William, and the team at Bluecore. We'll see you all again on next week's Tech Talk. Bye-bye.